Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm so impressed with the level of discussions and expertise that are here, and I'm very happy to be a part of it. So I come to you from the Institute of Nutrition and Aging. So everything we do involves nutrition and aging, and I'm going to share some of the things that we do at the center and what we know. So okay. So disclosure of some of the studies that I'll be talking about towards the end of my talk were partially funded by DSM Nutritionals and Mead Johnson. So just to give you an idea of where we're going to be going in the next 30 minutes, first of all, I'm going to give you the why. Why are we concerned about nutrition and aging with some of the statistics about the aging population? And then I'm going to give you the where. Where are we now? What do we know about as far as what's going on with aging and how nutrient content needs are changed with aging? And then I'm going to end up with what should we be thinking about? What are some special considerations that we need to be thinking about, not only with the nutrients that we know are essential, but some of these bioactives. Should we be thinking about them as far as healthy aging? So, okay, the why. We're all getting older. It's not like cancer or heart disease where some of us get it, some of us don't. We all are getting older. And so let's do that the best we can. So not only are we getting older, but more of us are getting older. By 2030, 1 in 5 of the population in the United States is going to be 65 years or older. So with that are going to be concerns about nutrition and how we can do age healthfully. So what are those changes that occur with aging? Well, there's a lot that goes on when we have to think about nutritional needs. It's from as far as the ability to buy food, the choices of food that are being bought. With aging, some nutrients are compromised in absorption. And even if they do get absorbed, the metabolism changes. So it's a lot of different things that are going on with aging that can compromise nutritional needs, nutritional status, nutritional effectiveness. And that all has to be considered when we talk about healthy aging. So there's a lot to talk about when it comes to nutrition and aging, and I cannot cover all of that in 30 minutes. It would take a long time. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to focus with some of the major nutritional concerns when it comes to aging. And one of the most prevalent issues that we think about when we think about geriatric care is atrophic gastritis. And that's pretty common. And what happens is the pH of the stomach actually goes up. Your pH normally is about 1 to 2. But with quite a few elderly, you see the pH going up, and with that, you have a compromise of some nutrient absorption. You have also peptic ulcer, which is common, and you can see it with overuse of antacids. And you see that with non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, you see that's quite common. And you see that there are problems with GI bleeding and mucosal injuries. So these are quite common changes that occur with the GI tract with aging. So I talked about atrophic gastritis, and this is a study that was done out of our center, the Boston Nutritional Status Survey, where they looked at the prevalence of atrophic gastritis, and they found that indeed it was quite prevalent, where you see age 60 to 69, you had about 1 in 5 people that had a pH in their stomach that was almost neutral. And the issue with atrophic gastritis is asymptomatic. Many people are walking around without even realizing that they have it. And that's an issue because some of the nutrients that are compromised with prolonged deficiency of these nutrients, they can lead to some pretty ill effects. So if you're 80 and over, they found that almost 40% had atrophic gastritis. And so why is that a big deal? Well, one of the nutrients that really has a problem with absorption with that pH going up in the stomach is B12. And so here's an example of that, and this is a study that was conducted under Rob Russell, who was the director of our center. And when they looked at people, when they looked at people with atrophic gastritis and looked at the absorption of B12, they found that compared to normals, it was much, much less absorbed when the B12 from food. That could be helped, though, however, if the B12 came from a supplement. But the problem here is, I told you, it's often asymptomatic, and you have a compromised B12 absorption, and with time, a B12 deficiency can lead to permanent neural damage. So this is really a big deal when it comes to aging and thinking about proper nutritional health. With the immune function, you see changes with aging as well. There's a decline in the mass of the immune tissue and function, particularly with the T cell function. And with that compromised immune function, you're going to see susceptibility to infection and some certain diseases like cancers. Now, there are many nutritional regulators of the immune system, and here's a list of many of them. I'm going to get, okay. Now, I really want to point out vitamins E and zinc in particular, because among the elderly, you see that these nutrients tend to be lower intake. So with the elderly, they tend to have lower intakes of these nutrients, and they're very important for proper immune function. And here's a study conducted under Samin Madani, who is the current director of our institute, where she looked at older people, those 65 years and older, and actually gave vitamin E supplements, and found that you could actually improve immune function in the elderly with a vitamin E supplement. So it's not all bad news. You can really help these problems that are going on with aging. Now, osteoporosis is a prevalent, it's a burdensome, it's a costly geriatric problem, and so it's not just about calcium and vitamin D. So with that, you see there's inadequate calcium and intake among the elderly. It's a common major mineral that you see is not adequately consumed among these people. Vitamin D is a big deal among the elderly, not because it hits from several different ways. Vitamin D, a major source of vitamin D is through the skin, production from the sunlight. When you think about the elderly, many of them are homebound. They have limited sunlight exposure, so that's one problem. Another problem is the metabolism. The vitamin E, the D, the active form of it occurs in the kidney, and that's compromised. You don't see as much production of the active form of vitamin D in the elderly. So there's a lot of things that metabolically go on with these older people that compromise vitamin D status, which is subsequently going to compromise your calcium status. There's other data to support that there are other nutrients involved with bone health, including folate, B12, and perhaps vitamin K. But it's not only getting enough of these vitamins, but there's other things in our diet that will compromise bone health by excess, such as alcohol, sodium, and caffeine, excuse me. Now, vitamin A, there's a question mark there because there have been some studies that have found that actually too much vitamin A is related to risk of bone fracture. And that's an issue because when you think about it, unlike 100 years ago when we didn't have access to vitamin supplementations, we do now. And with the elderly, with decades and decades and decades of taking that daily multivitamin, they run a risk of maybe getting too much vitamin A. It's a fat-soluble vitamin. You store it, and with years of taking more than you need, you build up excess, and that's been related to bone fracture. So you have impaired absorption of calcium, and again, that's related to the atrophic gastritis. And with that decreased absorption, you have it due to the resistance of that active form of vitamin D. So not only are they making less of it, but they're also, it's not working as well. So that's going to really affect the skeletal system. And I talked about this, how vitamin D, low status due to limited sun exposure, to the inability to synthesize that vitamin D from its precursor, and you have an impaired conversion in kidneys. Okay, so the bones are falling apart, and you also see a change in what's going on in body composition, what's being made up in the body. You have sarcopenia, and that's a term that was coined by Irv Rosenberg at our center, where with aging, you see a decrease in lean body mass. And that's often accompanied by an increase in fat mass, so the total body weight might not change. And when you have that decrease in lean body mass, there are a couple things that go along with that. You have a decrease in the resting energy expenditure, so there's a decreased need for calories. You have your decreased insulin sensitivity. You have increased frailty, muscle strength. So there's a lot that goes along with that decrease in lean body mass. So you have an increase in fat mass. And excessive body weight can predispose people to a variety of diseases, and we all know about how obesity is related to heart disease, stroke, hypertension, a variety of diseases. So if you look at what's going on in the elderly, there's really no discrimination of age when it comes to obesity. You find that there are quite a few, a big chunk of people in that age group who are obese and overweight, more than 50%. So here's another issue related to aging that we have to be thinking about. So what happens? We talked about these physiological changes that are going on with aging. How does it affect their nutrient needs? So as far as energy goes, we talked about that change in body composition. There's less lean body mass. There's less need for the caloric intake, so that's going to decrease those energy needs. And so there's also a decrease in physical activity. And we know with decreased physical activity, again, you have your decrease in energy needs. So the problem here is, though, as you decrease those energy needs, it's going to be harder to meet the nutrition requirements because now you need a more nutrient-dense diet. So you got to pack more nutrients in less calories. And that's going to be an issue with the elderly. It's going to be really hard to meet their needs of calcium, vitamin D, and B12. So often, supplementation is warranted for the elderly for these nutrients. As far as carbohydrates, there's really no change that goes with aging. The only reason you really have to think about the carbohydrate intake is because you have to think about the calories, and there's a decreased need for those calories. One thing that comes, though, along with this discussion on carbohydrates and aging is that fiber, because common complaints among the elderly are constipation, diverticulitis, diabetes, hyperlipidemia, which all has fiber as an important component of addressing these needs. Protein. Now, people have said there's really no need to increase the protein requirement for the elderly, although there is some discussion about that, particularly because you have many people who have stressors or institutionalized where there may be some additional need to increase protein intakes among the elderly. Fat intake, there's really no changes with aging, and they're really based on what their caloric intakes are. When we talk about fluids and electrolytes with aging, however, there's a change in thirst sensitivity, which decreases with age. There's also a decrease in ability for the kidneys to concentrate urine and conserve water, and often there's a voluntarily decrease in food intake because of this current concern with incontinence. And because you have these decreased intakes of fluid, you have a less body stores of your body water, so there's more risk of becoming dehydrated. It's harder to keep those reserves hydrated. So that's a real problem is hydration. And along with not being hydrated optimally, that can lead to some real problems as far as physiological effects. You have some nausea, you can have mental awareness problems, you can have problems with toxicity with drugs because of the decrease in body fluids. So, and also problems with regulating body temperature. So these are needs that really need to be carefully looked at as one ages. Now, going through the fat-soluble vitamins, the only one that really changes as one ages as far as their needs is vitamin D. And I talked about that, how the metabolism, the conversion, the active form, the efficiency of that active form to work with aging really all get compromised with aging. So those needs of vitamin D actually increase with aging. You don't see any change in the other fat-soluble vitamins. And to remind you, with vitamin A, in fact, we really don't worry about deficiencies with vitamin A in the elderly in general because of those prolonged high intakes with supplementation. As far as the water-soluble vitamins go, we see an increase in B6 because the metabolism of it changes with ages. So those go up. B12 doesn't really change, but I'd like to point that one on. I like to point that one out because of the prevalence of atrophic gastritis. I told you it's about 1 in 5 to 1 in 3 over 60 and above have this disease where they really need to be taking supplements. So that's one I like to point out. Even though the need doesn't change, the ability to meet their needs does. With the minerals, you see calcium going up because you're not able to absorb it as well. The vitamin D isn't working as well, so those needs go up. And iron goes down for postmenopausal women because they're not having those losses that they were having when they were premenopausal. So how are they doing? How are the elderly doing as far as meeting what we think they're needing? And this is a survey where we look at that, and you see that those Americans greater than 70 who are getting their vitamin intake at least less than 75% of the RDA, you see that a lot of them aren't making the mark. So there really are issues with what they're actually getting. So in summary, what I've told you so far is that there are inadequate dietary intakes to meet micronutrient requirements. That's pretty common among the elderly. And not only aren't they consuming them, but even when they are, there really is some issues as far as absorbing what they are even getting. And a lot of that has to do with, the atrophic gastritis that I spoke of and changes in metabolisms that occur with aging, such as what I've discussed with vitamin D. So another consideration that we really have to think about is as you age, you see an increased, prevalence of diseases, and along with that comes increased use of medication. In fact, older adults use greater than 25% of all prescriptions. And there's an average of 4.5 prescriptions per adult. So it's really an issue here when we're thinking about nutrition because there are drug-nutrient interactions. And here's just a list of a few of them. I won't go through them one by one, but it's something that really has to be carefully thought of when you're talking about the elderly, you're talking about nutrition. You really have to consider what drugs they are taking. A really common one is warfarin. A lot of people on warfarin. And what it does is what, vitamin K is doing. It's vitamin K, it's K for clotting. Warfarin is an anti-clotting. So you really have to think about pairing those two together and being careful about that. So not only do you have drugs that are going to interfere with the nutrient metabolism, but you have the reverse happening where you have nutrients that really interfere with the effectiveness of the drug. So again, these are issues that we have to consider the elderly that we're not thinking about, we don't really have to think too much about in the younger adult. So what does that mean? I told you that we have this aging population, we have more of them, we have these diseases that come along with it, we have the metabolism that's changing along this. Do we really need to think about reevaluating what the DRIs for them are? And I'm not coming to you with any answers to this question because I think we're not there yet as far as having an answer, but it's really to invite you to start thinking about that. And maybe it is a little bit too premature to be thinking about that because, we may even be having to think about reevaluating the DRIs as they are, which, for some of them it's been a long time since we've really been considering that. So that's just something to go home with to be thinking about. But now I want to kind of shift a little bit. We've been talking about essential nutrients and what we should be thinking about as we all are getting older. But that when you think about these essential nutrients, we're thinking about avoiding deficiency diseases. And I think now we're at a time where we're at almost a point where we're thinking about what's optimal. We're not so much concerned about scurvy or beriberi, but we're really concerned about how do we get optimal nutrition. And so that may go beyond our essential nutrients. It may go to other components in our diet that may be useful. So to illustrate this, I'm going to use the examples of age-related macular degeneration and cognitive decline in the elderly. And I like to point to these two because they are major issues among the elderly. So when you think about it, what are the things you're most concerned with as you get older? Dying, right? But after that comes your cognition and your vision. Those are huge, major issues among the elderly, and these are very prevalent among the elderly. And when we think about what our causes are related to the risk of both of these diseases, inflammation and oxidation are believed to be involved, and there's a lot of really good evidence that that's true. And so when I think about inflammation and oxidation, I think about the omega-3s, and I think about lutein. And lutein is a carotenoid. I'm from the Carotenoid Health Lab, and so it's a thing that I think about a lot. And so I think about these two, and there's a lot of good evidence to support their role in age-related macular degeneration. So I'm not going to go through that today, but believe me, we have a lot of different types of studies that have looked at this, and they're all pretty consistent that they're important. And so lutein, to give you just a little bit of background about what it is, it's one of more than 600 known naturally occurring plant pigments known as carotenoids. So when you look in the fall in New England, you see reds, you see oranges, you see yellows in those leaves. Those are all carotenoids. There's hundreds of them. But in our diet, we only eat about 50, one of which is lutein. And where you find lutein is going to be those green leafy vegetables like spinach and kale. What's really unique about lutein among these 600 is that it selectively gets taken up into the brain and the retina. In fact, in the retina, it's only one of 2 out of 600 or more that get in there. And in the brain, in our studies that we've done in human brain, it is the major carotenoid you find in your brain. And we believe that it's related to cognition. There's a lot of good work that says it's related to AMD as well. DHA is really pretty much a lot of similarities to lutein. We find it in fish, such as tuna and bluefish, and it's the predominant polyunsaturated fatty acid in the retina and brain, much like lutein. And low DHA status has been associated with AMD and cognitive function. So now I'm going to go over some of the data that we have generated from our lab to suggest that lutein and DHA are important for cognition in the elderly. And this was a double-blinded, placebo-controlled trial in healthy older women where they were given placebo. They were given lutein at about 12 milligrams a day, which is a dietary intake. It's about a quarter cup of spinach, cooked spinach, so it's not a lot. The problem is people aren't eating half a cup of spinach a day in the United States. And we gave them DHA at levels of 800 milligram a day, or else we gave the combination. So and it was a 4-month intervention, and when we looked at differences from baseline, we found that all the interventions, whether it be DHA alone, lutein alone, or the combination, these women actually improved in executive function, which was really remarkable because usually when you think about aging, you just want to maintain. You just don't want to go down. And here we had improvement, and so we were quite surprised by this. And when we looked at learning, as measured by the shopping list, which looked at the change in number of trials to learn a list. So in this case, the faster you learn, the better. And what we found is that combination of lutein and DHA actually improved, again, in learning in these women. And we found that to be true also for short-term memory. Now, we had another study, which was the Georgia centenarian study, where we actually had access to brain tissues, which we measured for carotenoids. In these brain tissues, we had data of pre-mortem measures of cognitive function. And what we found here was that brain levels of lutein was related to this global deterioration scale, which is a measure of dementia. And scales 1 to 3, 1 being cognitively intact, 3 is some mild cognitive impairment, that with as levels went down, there was an increased risk of less cognitive function. And this was only true for lutein. We looked at all the other carotenoids. We looked at alpha tocopherol, which is an antioxidant. It's a major antioxidant and levels much higher than lutein in the brain, but there was no relationship there. So it seemed to be something unique about lutein that we were finding. And we had other measures of cognitive function. We found the same thing to be true. The lutein, more lutein, the better off they were as far as their cognition. We didn't find it for any of their carotenoids. We didn't find it for alpha tocopherol. Now, this is messy, and it's just to remind me what I want to tell you is that we also looked at DHA in these brains and related them to all these measures of cognitive function in these people, and DHA had the most consistent relationships with cognition in this study among those fatty acids. Now, when we looked at the interaction, we find that there really was significant interaction of lutein and the DHA working together as far as their relationship to cognition. And when you think about it, it kind of makes sense because I told you lutein's an antioxidant, and DHA is highly oxidizable, so it's good to pair those two. You find them together in the bilayer of the cell membrane, and there's just many ways to believe that they are indeed working together. So what I've told you is that lutein and DHA status are related to better cognitive function in the elderly. And I just showed you some of our data, but we have other different kinds of data to support this. And that the association of lutein or DHA with cognitive function is dependent on each other, but their combined effect was less than it was expected if the two were put together, and that kind of makes sense too, because you may be using lutein at its expense to really protect the DHA and vice versa. So I'm trying to convince you that maybe these things are important to be looking at the elderly, and there are dietary recommendations for intake as for heart health, and they vary a little bit, but there are some recommendations out there. Now, as far as lutein, there is no recommended allowance for lutein because it's not essential, but the positive effects on eye disease suggest that around 6 milligrams a day are important. Here's the problem, though. In the U.S., the intakes of the omega-3 fatty acid and lutein is below what we think are important for most individuals, and here they are. When you look at Ann Haynes' data, the average intake of omega-3 DHA for those greater than 50 is less than 100 milligrams a day. So that's well below what we think is important. And for lutein, it's less than 2 milligrams a day, and we think around 6 milligrams is important. So here are two bioactives that we have a lot of strong evidence to support their role in neural health, but among the target population where we think this is important, they're not getting it. So does that mean that we should really be in a position to make some guidelines to help these people understand their importance and how much they should be getting? So that's pretty much all I have to tell you, and I just want to end up with this icon that was developed from Tubbs on the food pyramid for older adults that really kind of combines a lot of the different things I talked about. I talked about a more nutrient-dense diet. So compared to the pyramid that was used for the adult, this one's narrower to smash in more nutrients and less food. And what you also see is the recommendation for fluid intake, and you also see a little flag to recommend the use of supplements for these nutrients that they really have a hard time getting in these foods, being calcium, vitamin D, and B12. So with that, I thank you for your attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, ILSI Europe and ILSI Southeast Asia region were given the task to map the activities under the thematic area nutrition, health and well-being of all the ILSI branches. So here you see the flowchart, or in other words, the working plan, what we tried to do. So first we tried to clarify the objectives, to try to understand what was expected from us to do. Then we started the planning, we had a series of conference calls, then we prepared the questionnaire, and we asked the branches to fill out and to indicate what kind of activities they have from the field of nutrition, health and well-being. The branches filled up the questionnaire, we collected all the results, and besides that, we wanted to make sure that we read all available documents as well. Any additional information was taken into account. So after receiving all the information, we analyzed the outcome, and we tried to do a kind of mapping. Once we had all the activities put into a huge matrix, then we tried to identify key areas or main themes, if you like. And then I think it's obvious that health, nutrition, and well-being such an extremely huge area that it's almost impossible to do professionally without additional resources, a professional kind of mapping. So we decided to take a kind of case study. That was healthy aging. I will just come back to it in a minute. You may argue that healthy aging in itself is a huge area. Yes, it is. But anyway, we thought that we might go ahead with this. Once we decided to have this case study, then still, as far as it was a big area, then we tried to identify different clusters. And then we came up again with a table summarizing or trying to summarize, not all because not everyone responded, but most of the different, very, very diverse activities the different branches have in the field of health, nutrition, and well-being. This is just a short list of those other sources which were used, which were read, besides the questionnaire kindly filled up by most of the branches. Here you see the list of those branches who filled it up. So the response rate was 60,000. As I said, after we collected all the different topics, projects, the different branches been working on, then we try to identify within nutrition, health, and well-being so-called key areas. Here you see the list, or at least part of the list, as healthy aging, weight management, energy balance, non-communicable diseases, functional foods, gut health, nutrition labeling, early life nutrition, dietary issues and lifestyle, diet quality, research integrity, nutrition survey methods, and food composition data, and last but not least, omics-related activities. So these were the 13 so-called key areas within nutrition, health, and well-being identified. You may end up with a different kind of grouping, of course. So that was one way of trying to make sure that instead of just a huge list, we have certain groups of different activities. The purpose is not to read this table, just to show you that horizontally, we had the different branches, and vertically these different thematic or key areas, if you like. This shows just one part of that in gray, you see, of that huge table we came up with. So if you will ever have the time, I would suggest you to read this, and you will have a very good idea how many different activities are going on related to nutrition, health, and well-being, at least within 10 branches. So after having these key areas, as I said, we wanted to choose a kind of case study. Here, what you see in this table is the number of branches which are involved in activities related to these key areas. And although there are certain areas where there are 10, 11 branches are involved, but some of them have just very marginal or very small activities. And healthy aging attracts 6 branches attention for the moment, 3 big ones and 3 smaller ones. But still, we decided that healthy aging could be an interesting case to further study. Why? Because we thought that it is a very relevant issue. It might be of interest worldwide, and there are many, many related scientific activities going on, and there is still a lack for scientific knowledge in certain areas. So you may come up with all kinds of reasoning why healthy aging was considered as an important area, but we seem to be convinced that this is something worth to further work with without, as you said earlier, narrowing too much the area. And I think it's obvious that healthy aging in itself is quite broad. We already have some expertise at some branches, but it offers further opportunities for all other branches. And in certain regions, it might be more important than in others, but it seems to be important worldwide. So once it was decided that healthy aging will be our case study, we tried to set up another matrix showing again in more detail activities of the different branches in this particular area. And again, you only see here a small part of this table, because if you wanted to show it in gray, you see what you saw just before. We came up with 7 different clusters. Again, you may argue that you can group the different activities in a different way, but we thought, the participants of this exercise or activity thought that the definition of healthy aging and biomarkers, biology of aging, current population status, optimizing the aging process, non-communicable diseases and aging, dietary guidances, and cognition-related activities could be a kind of grouping or clusters within healthy aging. So, just Friday, during the branch staff meeting, there was an exercise where participants discussed this area as a potentially interesting case study, and they came up with a different grouping: biology, global status, risk factors, intervention, and policy. So this might be the basis for the future activities. Global status from amongst these issues was identified as one of the potential areas, because this requires probably less financial input or resources than others, and there might be need for data collected at a global level. So here you see the next steps. The first one, which is happening now, presentation of information and discussion. Those who want to be involved or are interested to be involved need to discuss the next steps, need to understand and identify the final objectives and potential impact, calculate the resources which have been spent or need to be spent in the future, find the funding sources, establish the work process, identify potential key stakeholders to be involved in this procedure, and last but not least, define a project proposal, one project which could be shared in between the branches. And some of you might have heard already what I said about ILSI Europe's activities. As an example, when we had a feeling that there is a need for redefining and prioritizing our scientific portfolio, and for this reason, with our scientific advisory committee, we did this mapping exercise. And again, what was the purpose? That instead of grouping our activities just under food safety and nutrition, and maybe societal aspects, we came up with a matrix which would show the complexity of our activities. And here you see that in spite of what I said about the previous topic, that the existing activities were listed, we took into account not just the existing activities of ILSI Europe, different task forces and expert groups, but also the new activity proposals being under review, those being under development by our members, the emerging issues identified by our task forces, emerging issues identified by participants of brainstorming workshop we organized. Our scientific advisory committee identified gaps and emerging opportunities. So we came up with this complex matrix in which you do not only have major pillars as kind of overarching issues, but you also have subgroups or subtopics. And those who heard my presentation before understood how we did group the different activities. And here you see one of our 6 main pillars: nutrition, development, and healthy aging. And just to show you the complexity, here you see the different 4 sub-pillars, if you like. And without going into details, I think it shows you how complex activity it was, and I think it might serve as a model. Thank you for your attention.